Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Smart and Healthy, Successful Organizations Balance Both, presented by Dennis Lanham, Senior Assistant Dean of Executive Education and Executive Director of the Silicon Valley Executive Center at Santa Clara University. My name is Muriel. I am on the higher education team here at Ivy Exec, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can also do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will be having a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter. Dennis Lanham is the Senior Assistant Dean of Executive Education and Executive Director of the Silicon Valley Executive Center at Santa Clara University. With more than 15 years of experience in business education, nonprofit, and program management, Dennis has built numerous programs for businesses and working professionals across industries in leadership development, corporate innovation and entrepreneurship, operations excellence, and many other business critical areas. Before moving to California, Dennis led university-based executive education programs in the Nebraska and Georgia markets. As head of executive ed at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and assistant director at Georgia State University. Prior to his career in executive education, Dennis worked in nonprofit administration as the director of member services for Phi Beta Sigma, a service-based nonprofit fraternal organization based in Washington, D.C., and spent several years in student affairs administration. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Dennis.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure being here and being able to speak with all of you today. I'm hoping that we can have a really healthy discussion around how organizations balance both being smart and healthy. We have had the privilege of partnering with the Table Group, which is a company that was founded by and run by Patrick Lencioni, who's a very famous leadership author who has specialized a lot of his work around the development of teams, both executive teams and teams at lower levels of the organization. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the organizational health model, which is a model now that we here at Santa Clara University are building into a lot of our executive programming. It's a model that I personally believe in, and it's a model that's been proven in practice for many organizations that the Table Group has worked with over the last several decades. So with that, I want to first start a little bit about myself, and you've already gotten my intro, so I'll sort of speed through this. But I started off my career in student affairs, so in higher education. I've been working in a university setting and nonprofit settings for quite some time now. Received my first degree at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, for those of you who might be familiar. Did a master's degree in higher ed administration at Florida State University. And then, like was pointed out, was director of member services for this nonprofit organization, my fraternal organization based in Washington, D.C. Spent several years there and then really decided that I wanted to get into business education. And so from there, I transitioned to Georgia State University, where I received my MBA, but I also got my foot in the door working in university-based executive ed and have been doing that ever since. So I wrapped up the MBA after several years at Georgia State and was recruited out to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is a school that was hoping to enter the executive ed space. And so I was brought in as the inaugural director to sort of build that operation from the ground up. And from there was recruited here to the Levy School of Business out in California. Santa Clara University, and I've been here for I think 3 years next month. So I've been enjoying my time here, and I just wanted to start by giving you a little context about myself and some background on myself. But like I said, we partnered with Pat Lencioni. The partnership began in 2017, and we worked to launch a really big event here that we did on our campus with his company, and we had over 500 people fly in from all over the world. And mostly here domestically, but a few from other countries, to listen to Pat speak specifically about this organizational health model that we're going to cover today. You know, Pat has written and sold a lot of books, over 6 million copies sold. And so it's possible that you might know his models, or that maybe you've even seen him speak. And so this may be a refresher for some, and it may be new concepts for others. But one thing I love about the organizational health model is that it's simple enough to understand, but powerful enough to really have profound impact in the way that we like to see organizations grow and develop. So when we say smart versus healthy, we really distinguish between those two words in a couple of ways. So when you think about a smart organization, that means that they're really good at strategy, they're good at marketing, finance, technology, operations, everything that you need technically to really make an organization run efficiently and achieve the strategic objectives, the revenue objectives, and otherwise. But when we say healthy, we're really talking about an environment that cultivates minimal politics, minimal confusion, high morale, high productivity, low turnover. And so essentially in creating environments where people really have complete clarity of understanding the purpose, mission, roles and responsibilities of the organization, and who are happy working in that organization. We believe that organizations are built to be smart naturally, right? You're built around some sort of technical expertise or product offering, and as a result of the need to get those things to market and really sustain a healthy company, you've got to have smart competencies, if you will. And sometimes organizations lose the focus on the healthy piece, and that's where you can really get yourself into trouble. And so that's what the webinar is going to be about today. I wanted to start by talking about Terry Griffith, who is one of our faculty members here at Santa Clara, who is really sort of the champion and in partnership with Pat to find this opportunity to integrate the theoretical models that we spend a lot of time in university settings researching and understanding, and sourcing models like Pat to sort of supplement and complement those empirically validated management theories that we have in university systems. It's sort of rare and it's kind of tricky to have a partnership with an external consultant in the way that we do. Fortunately for us, Pat Lencioni's sons go here at Santa Clara. They're both undergraduate students. And as a result, we were really able to connect with him and find this opportunity for synergies. And so Terry Griffith is going to start and explain just a little bit about how smart and healthy organizations interact.
Pat talks about healthy being the multiplier of smart, and I like to draw this as two concentric circles. As I think about an organization that's just starting on its organizational health journey, that organizational health circle might start out small. The organizational smarts circle would be bigger because most organizations are designed to be smart. But what we hope for you is that as you progress in your organizational health journey, that organizational health circle is going to get bigger. And what's going to happen then is the organizational smart circle is going to get bigger too.
So as you can see, there's a really good correlation between the ability for an organization to grow more smart in terms of its competencies and the expertise needed to really have a healthy, profitable company. And part of the way to do that is to really focus on the health piece. And so this organizational health model, which you see in front of you now, is really a 4-piece model. It is ordered, and so the model, it's really important to really understand each piece in its order. So we're going to start by talking about the first piece of the model, which is building a cohesive leadership team at the executive level. And then the second piece of the model is creating clarity. And then after you've built a cohesive team, created clarity, then you're able to over-communicate that clarity in the organization, and then make sure that you have the human systems and all the other systems in place to really reinforce that clarity. So we'll start by talking about the first piece of the model again, which is building a cohesive leadership team. This piece of the model comes out of Pat Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team book, which some of you might know. It's a pretty famous book. In fact, I think it's his bestseller. And so this is the model here. It's a 5-part model, also ordered. starting from the base of this pyramid and going upward. And so we're first going to talk a little bit about the absence of trust. When Pat talks about the absence of trust, he's really talking about vulnerability-based trust, right? And so it's not just the ability for employees and team members to trust each other in terms of getting their work done, but it's really more so trust that comes about as a result of team members' ability and the leader's ability to actually be vulnerable and be able to admit when they're wrong, and be able to have communication in place that allows for vulnerability, so that people can really truly trust each other. And so in order to do this, really the leader has to model the way, and that's another overlap with other models that are empirically validated. You may know Barry Posner and Jim Kouz's work. They've been around in the leadership space for quite some time, and one of the pieces of their famous model is model the way. The leader has to take the first step and has to be the first one to show that sort of vulnerability in order for the rest of the team and other employees to really do the same, right? And when you get past that point, then you're able to really develop that trust. So here's a quick video of Pat. Pat is an amazing entertainer. He speaks all the time, and he's very engaging. So I pulled in a couple videos from him from various things that he's done to give you a sense of the perspective on some of the pieces of this model.
I once worked with a famous CEO, you know who this guy is, but who was not a great leader when he was at this other company. Maybe he's better now, he's moved on to go someplace else. But he wasn't vulnerable, and it crushed the organization eventually. Of course, what did all the people say in the media? They said, oh, they failed because they had product problems or strategy issues. But those were downstream symptoms of the real problem. Of course, they had product issues and strategy problems. They had no trust on the executive team, and it emanated from the CEO. That was the core issue. And here's what happened. See, he was famous and brilliant and intimidating, so nobody disagreed with him. Nobody gave him feedback. Nobody pushed back on him. Finally, the head of human resources, God bless her, she said, listen, nobody's telling you the truth. Nobody's pushing back. You've got to do something to get people to open up with you. And they decided they want to do 360 feedback, which I don't always like. It depends how it's done. It can be good. It can be not. But they decided they wanted to do that, and they asked my little firm, this was my first client, to administer this 360 feedback tool. So I did, and we surveyed everybody on the team and then gave him the results, and he proceeded to share those results with no one. So the head of HR said, listen, you got to tell people what you learned and what your areas of improvement are. And he goes, okay, I'll do it at the next staff meeting. So at the next staff meeting, he got up in front of everybody, and he reluctantly allowed me to come and observe as the person who administered the tool. So I sat off to the side on a little chair, which had wheels on the bottom of it, which will become relevant here in just a second. And he stands up and he says, it says here I'm not a very good listener. Huh? What do you guys think? Now, I could not write this. Most of my books are fiction. I could never put this. In fact, I remember that day thinking I could never write this. Nobody would believe this, because they went around that table and said, oh, I think you're a good listener. I think you're a good listener too. Yeah, I don't have a problem with your listening. So yeah, you're a good listener. You're a listener. Yeah, fine. And he said, okay, good. Next one. And I was sitting there thinking, I can't believe I'm watching this happen. This is a true story. And so then he says, it says here I don't give enough feedback or enough praise. I thought I'd gotten better at that. What do you guys think? Yeah, I think you've gotten better. I think you're good at it. I think you're better than the last guy. I don't have a problem with it. Blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there on my little chair as a consultant, and I joke about this now, but it was not an easy day. And I sat there and I thought, if I have any integrity as a consultant, this is where I have to lose a client or put one in jeopardy, right? So I get on my little chair and I'm like, eek, 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 eek. And I scoochie up right next to this famous CEO. And I'm like, excuse me, you guys are the only people who filled this out. So somebody had to write this. It's very quiet in that room. Till the head of marketing slowly raised his hand, poor guy, and said, yeah, I'd like to get more feedback. I mean, my team would like to get more feedback from you. They only hear from you when they screw up. And I think it'd be nice if you told them what they were doing well. Yeah, I could vouch for that. Silence. Till the head lawyer goes, not me. I think you get plenty of feedback. And everybody else said, so do I. They crushed the guy. He was just like, I'm dying. So the moral of that story is this. That's the day the CEO stood there and said, I'm not going to be vulnerable. Not going to do it. And you guys probably shouldn't either. And nobody ever had a problem in that company. No, everybody said, I'm doing fine. No, I don't have any issues. I'm not wrong. Of course, it spun out of control. You know, now, Now, what should that CEO have done? All he had to do was stand up there. He didn't have to cry or do anything weird. Just had to stand up there and say, hey, I see that these are my areas for improvement. I've heard about these in performance reviews during my career. And well, my wife tells me this once a week or so. And I know I'm not great at this. I'll give it a shot. You can call me on it. I don't know that I'll ever be fantastic at it, but I'll try. And I know this is my weakness. Now, what are yours? Nope. He stood up there like, no, I'm fine. Like the friggin' emperor with no clothes, you know, big old butt hanging out. How do I look, guys? Like, you look fine, boss. Okay.
So for those of you who, hopefully everybody, first of all, was able to see the video, and if you had bandwidth issues or Wi-Fi issues and you weren't able to really follow along, essentially the story that Pat told was that the CEO of this company was so concerned about his image and how he's perceived as a leader that he was completely unable to be vulnerable. And I think that, and I'm, based on my own experience and the many executives that I've worked with, that the person at the top really gets to set the tone, right? We collectively, as teams and as groups of people, groups of human beings, get to really determine what the culture is, right? Because the culture is a mix of all of our behaviors and all of the values that we sort of bring to the table. But the leader gets to set the guardrails. The leader gets to set the tone. And if the leader is unable to be vulnerable, then that sets the precedent for everybody else to sort of to model that, right? And as a result, a lack of vulnerability does not allow employees and team members to really trust each other, right? And so there are a few tools if you have an issue here and you think this may be one of the dysfunctions that you or your team is facing. There are a few tools that you can use. One of them that I've actually used with my own team is what you see on the screen in front of you now, and that's the personal histories exercise. All right. So sometimes building trust is as simple as getting to know the person that is on your team. Sometimes we're so in the weeds, and we think it to be unprofessional to really get to know people at the level where we can really understand why they behave the way they do, right? And so this is one simple activity that you can do. It doesn't take very long, depending on the size of the team. He specifically talks about executive teams being smaller, so anywhere from 5 to no more than 10, but ideally 7 to 8 people at a max. And so you can go around the room and ask these really simple questions that may give you some insight to the people that you're working with as to why they make decisions, how they approach problem solving, and you may explain away a little bit of some of the things that you've witnessed in terms of their own behavior. So simple questions like, where did you grow up? How many siblings do you have, and where do you fall in that order? And then describing challenges that you might have from your childhood. And sometimes that allows for the team members to really get a chance to know each other on a deeper level, and it builds a sense of trust, which is what the base of the first piece of the model is. So once the leader has modeled the way and there is trust on a team, then the next thing that you have to deal with is the fear of conflict. I think as human beings, we all have, not all, but many of us have an aversion to confronting conflict. And so really, if you're able to have that sense of trust and really vulnerability-based trust, then you can have candid debate, right? Because that's what conflict allows for. Pat talks about the leader really having a role for mining for conflict and really looking for friction on teams, in a way that's going to create more healthy discussion for the outcome of the organization. And so that's what this second piece of the model is. Now there is healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict, right? And so you want to focus on the conflict that's really about the best interest of the organization. And if you have a sense of trust and a vulnerability-based trust culture in your organization, then you're more likely to be able to have conversations that might not be comfortable, but everybody knows that the intent of the intent of the discomfort is really and the conversation is really to get at the heart of what's the best for the organization, and that's what this piece of the model is all about. If you can have healthy conflict and you really can use it in a way that you can again push the organization forward, then you're more likely to commit, right? And also in that conflict or the process for getting to what's best for the organization, you have a lot of debate, right? And so people are able to actually voice their opinion. And it's not based on personality conflict. It's based on, again, what's the best for the organization. And so if you can come to a point where you're mining for that sort of conflict to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and everybody's had a chance to vent themselves, and then they're more likely to commit to whatever the final decision is. And I think that's the intent of this third piece of the model. From there, when the team is collectively committed and people have had a chance to voice their opinion, even if they disagree with the decision, at least they've had a chance to engage in healthy debate, healthy conflict, to come to a committed decision. Then everybody's on the same page, and from there you're able to hold each other accountable. There's another quick video I want to show about accountability from Pat. So we're going to pause here, and I'm gonna show you all this video.
CEOs I met leaders that didn't like accountability. There was this one guy who ran a company, and he got hired to turn it around. It was in trouble. And he was the president, CEO, and chief operating officer of the company, right? He had all the big titles. Well, after a year of stabilizing the company, he was pretty tired of being all those things. So he went to the board of directors and said, I don't want to be the president and chief operating officer anymore. I just want to be the CEO so I can focus on strategy and customers and let somebody else run the day-to-day operations. The board said, fine, you've earned the right to do that. Go out and hire yourself a new president and chief operating officer. So he went out looking for somebody, and one of his direct reports, who I will call Fred, started to tell everybody in the company, I'm going to be the next president. It will be me. I'm sure he's going to name me the next president. And I remember hearing it too and thinking, well, it must be true. Well, this guy, Fred, was not well liked by his peers at all. And so people were like, oh no, that guy might be our boss. One member of the executive team finally went to the CEO, knocked on his door and said, hey, can I ask you a question, boss? He goes, yeah, what is it? Hey, is Fred going to be the new president and COO? No, first he said, did you know Fred is telling everybody he's going to be the new president CEO? And the boss said, no, I had no idea. I had not heard that at all. He goes, okay, so is he going to be the next president? And the CEO said, no, absolutely not. That would be a terrible decision. I would do it. You guys, oh, good, thank God. Okay, final question. Are you going to tell him to quit telling everybody that? And you know what the CEO said verbatim? And I hear this from leaders all the time. Our wonderful priest friends here, pastors, you've probably said, he said, oh, I don't have the time and the energy for that. Which is funny because it's like, hey, Fred, it's the CEO. How you doing? Yeah, hey, you're not going to be the next president. No, you're really pissing me off that you're telling everybody that. Yeah, you should stop or something bad might happen to you. Okay, have a great day, buddy. Bye-bye. What did that take, like 10 seconds? And I'm not tired. Are you tired? I mean, that didn't tire me out.
So again, just as a quick summary of that, the story was about the CEO being scared of holding his team accountable for their behaviors, right? And so if you're committed, if you've gone through all these other stages, you have vulnerability-based trust, you're able to have healthy conflict that's really best really meant to help push the organization forward. Everybody can then commit via healthy debate. They can walk away and all be committed to whatever that collective goal is. Then they get a chance to hold each other accountable. And if that's not coming from the top of the organization, then again, modeling that behavior has a trickling effect down the organization. And so not only will the team members not hold each other accountable, but their team members will not be able to hold each other accountable as well, right? And so the point of the video was really that, again, the leader has to be the first one to do that. And a lot of people are really scared of accountability. And I learned really early on as an undergraduate student from one of my mentors many years ago, that there's no way that I can say that I care about you or I love you, if it's in a family context, if I don't hold you accountable. That's the other side of the coin. I've got to be able to hold you accountable to express my care for you. Not only that, but I've got to be able to hold you accountable so that we can keep the commitment from the collective team cohesive, and so that we're all moving in the same direction. And if you can get to that point of accountability and really building a culture of accountability, then there's more opportunity to really focus on the results, right? What are the collective results that we're trying to get done here? And if you've hit all of these other things, then you're more likely to really pay attention to the outcomes that the organization desires. So that's the first piece of the organizational health model. So I wanted to pause here and do a quick poll. Now that we've gone through, and I know that I went through these very quickly. I apologize. We're under a little bit of time constraint today, but I wanted to at least expose you all to each piece of the model. So based on the presentation so far, I'm curious to know which of the dysfunctions that we've described might your team be currently most susceptible to.
Right. The poll is launched, so please fill in the poll. We'll leave it open for about 10 to 15 seconds. Great, just a couple more seconds, so get your answers in. All right, closing the poll now. And the results are 29% said absence of trust, 24% said fear of conflict, 3% said lack of commitment, 34% said avoidance of accountability, and 11% said inattention to results.
Yeah. So that, looks like I need to share my screen again. Can you all see the screen?
Oh, yeah, Dennis, if you can turn on the presentation again.
There we are.
There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's about what I anticipated. It's typically accountability and trust, right? Just the two things that actually I had videos pulled for to talk about that I think not just leaders, but human beings in general really have they have problems with, and it makes sense. So I think the takeaway there is that it's really something that has to be practiced, right? Anytime we're having to push ourselves out of our comfort zone, the more we practice that, the better we become. And so, creating a vulnerability-based trust culture on your team takes practice. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's something that you really have to pay attention to continuously. It's not something that you can do a one and done. And so it's something that you've got to build into the culture. You've got to build that muscle in the organization, and that takes time and it takes intention. So thank you for your responses. So here are 3 just reflective questions. If you want to jot these down quickly, we're not going to really spend much time on here, but I want you to think about how each of these dysfunctions that we talked about manifests itself on your own team. So what are the things that you actually can see from a behavioral standpoint on your team based on the dysfunctions that we've talked about to this point? And brainstorm, how would improved cohesion on your team, how would that help the team's performance, right? How does that help get the team to where they're trying to go in terms of their outcomes or their measurable goals? And then what immediate steps do you think that you could take to address this particular dysfunction on your team? There are a lot of resources for each piece of this model that you can find on the organizational health website, which is the Table Group's website. And so if you're curious to learn about some different sorts of tools, there's a resource library available for you on that website. I went through one example in terms of vulnerability-based trust, and that was the personal histories exercise, but there are tons of others that can help you with each of the dysfunctions that we've talked about. So essentially the checklist for the first piece of the model, the 5 dysfunctions, or building a cohesive leadership team are, you want to make sure that the team makes sense in terms of its size. I talked about 10 people max, and we're talking about the senior team, so the executive level team. There may be organizations that you're a part of or that you know of that have more than that, and it really it's more difficult to create the culture that you want and to really be able to create that sense of cohesion if the leadership team is too large. Members of the team have to trust each other. They've got to be able to be genuinely vulnerable with each other. Team members have to be able to regularly engage in productive, unfiltered conflict around important issues, right? And it has to be conflict that's healthy. We talked about that. So in other words, the conflict has to be conflict that is meant to move the organization forward, not person-to-person conflict or personality conflict. The team would be leaving the meeting with really a clear understanding about what the decision is, and also having been able to vent their opinion because of that conflict process, or that mining for conflict process that we talked about. And then from there, members are able to hold one another accountable to the commitment or the decision. And then members of the leadership team are focused on team number 1. So there's this other concept that Pat talks about, which is validated through other empirical research that you can find in the management space, about the best way to think about loyalty is whatever team that you are that's the highest level team that you're a part of, whether it's the executive level team, maybe you're on a senior VP team, or you are the senior VP team leading a larger team, whatever that largest team or highest team in the organization that you're a part of, that is where your number one loyalty is, right? Because that's what creates alignment. And one of the things that we see in organizations that we work with that are having issues around employee behavior and confusion is misalignment, because the executive team is not well aligned. And the best way to create that sense of alignment is to understand the highest team that you're a part of and your loyalty to that team above anything else. And hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, just let us know. We're going to try to entertain some questions toward the end of the presentation. But essentially, you have to put the collective priorities and needs of the larger organization ahead of your own specific unit. So that's the first discipline. The second discipline is what's called creating clarity. So we're going to spend just a couple seconds here talking about that. So there's 6 critical questions that Lencioni suggests that organizations ask themselves to really create clarity in that organization. The first is, why do we exist? You'd be surprised how many times companies don't spend a lot of time talking about why it is that they exist. They're so wrapped up in quarter-to-quarter pressures and other things. They get so in the weeds in management that they sort of lose that sort of essential question that needs to be at the core of any organization. That's, what are we doing here? Why do we exist, right? And so, that you have to be able to have things in place that really continue to make sure that every team in the organization is focused on that question and really has clarity around what that question is. We're human beings, so many of us, we wake up in the morning and we need a sense of purpose, right? And so you don't just go to a job necessarily just to go to that job. You really need to understand the organization that you're spending your life's energy with and why that organization exists. So that's the first question. The second question is, how do we behave? This is another difficult one that I'm not sure a lot of organizations spend enough time on. So what are the actual behaviors? What are the very few core values that are required for the success of the organization? A lot of times companies spend time and energy and resources coming up with a list of 10 or 15 different questions, or core values, and that's far too many. You really want to keep this to 3 to 5, no more than 5 really fundamental core values of an organization, because any more than that, it just says that you're throwing these things on the board because they're things that you think are important, but they're not really getting to the very core of the purpose of the organization. And from that, you can really develop behaviors that are acceptable within the organization. And so the second question again is, how do we behave? How do we interact with each other? What's acceptable and what's not acceptable based on the values that we've determined to be the core values of this organization. And then the third question is, what do we do? So what space are you in? You'd be surprised how many companies really don't have a full understanding of their own space. Are they a product-oriented company? Are they a service-based company? Are they a blend of both? Those are clarifying questions that have to be asked and understood at the highest levels of the organization, so that sort of clarity can be filtered down the organization. So this leads us to the second poll. I wanted to focus on that second question. I'm curious to know where you fit on this spectrum. So the question is, I fully understand the behavioral values of my organization. So I'll turn it over now for the second poll.
Great, the second poll is now launched, so please answer on the pop-up box in your screen. Again, we'll leave it up for another 5 to 10 seconds so everyone has a chance to answer. All right, seems like we have the votes in. Closing the polls now. 12% said strongly agree, 65% said agree, 21% said disagree, and 3% said strongly disagree.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. I'll tell you, even the organizations that I've worked for, we really struggle, some of them, we've really struggled with having a sense of really an understanding of not just the values, but how those values are translated to behavior. And you're unable to have a culture of accountability in any organization unless you really have a sense of the things that are acceptable and not acceptable in the culture of that organization. So it's good to see that so many of you have a full understanding of the values of your organization. Make sure that you also understand how those values translate to actual behavior that is acceptable and that which is not. The fourth question that Lencioni says that organizations really need to create clarity is they've got to be able to answer, how do we succeed, right? If you've gotten through the first three and you know the space that you're in, you know the core business that you're in, then what's the strategy for the organization to be able to get there? Fifth question is, and this is something I've personally struggled with some of the teams that I've worked with in the past, is what's most important right now? A lot of times, organizational leaders make the mistake of having too many things on the plate and all of them having equal importance. And so there's a couple ways to, if you're dealing with that, there's a couple of ways to sort of handle that. One of the things that I think is important is sort of having focus meetings, and that's something that I've recently started with my own team. So every Monday morning, 10 a.m., we all come together and we talk about what is most important right now, right? And you can think of it week to week, but you can also think of it quarter over quarter. But there's got to be a sense of a unifying thematic goal, like you see here, that sort of brings everybody together around and rallies everybody around what is most important to this organization right now so that we can continue to accomplish our goals. And then the fifth question is, who must do what? So really it's around clarity on roles and responsibilities and how we're going to achieve success in what's important right now, and then also achieve success with the long-term strategy of where we're headed and where our objectives are as an organization. So those are the 6 critical questions. The checklist that I have for discipline 2 is here. So you'll know that you're creating clarity if members of the leadership team are all in alignment and they're passionate about the reason that the organization exists. The leadership team has clarified and embraced a very small specific set of values, but they also understand how those values translate to behaviors that are acceptable and those that are not in the organization. Leaders are clear. They're all aligned around strategy, and they understand how to define their success specifically as compared to their competitors. The leadership team has a very clear goal that they're rallying around, and that they're able to communicate out to have other team members have clarity around, to rally around, and everybody feels sort of a collective sense of ownership for that specific goal. Again, the weekly check-ins are good there, but also understanding that over a period of 2 to 4 months, that there is something more important than other things that we all sort of need to have our energies focused around. And then members of the leadership team understand everybody's roles. There's an activity I recently did with my own team to make sure that there was more transparency from team to team or subunit to subunit on what are the roles and responsibilities of each one of these units and how do they fit into the collective organization, right? So that's just another way to ensure that there's clarity across the organization. And then the elements of the organization's clarity are concisely summarized, and so they're very clear, and they're also talked about a lot. So they're consistently and regularly reviewed and referenced by the leadership team, and that communication should be cascaded down the organization. So that's the checklist to ensure that clarity is being created in the organization. The third piece of the model is what Pat calls over-communicating clarity. So once you've built a cohesive leadership team and you really have focused in on creating crystal clear clarity, then you have to be able to over-communicate that. There are 4 things here that he talks about in terms of, and some of this may be familiar with some of you, but commitment clarification. So, the strategy that requires meetings and discussions are reviewed for alignment, and there's got to be buy-in. So, going back to that sense of debate from the first dysfunction, there's got to be buy-in and everybody has to be able to have their voice heard in order for the group to be able to commit. Cascading communication, which essentially is just the process and the methods and the channels by which organizations communicate down, have to be, that structure has to be in place, and those channels need to be utilized. And that's really, formal communication, right? And it's the processes by which organizations are able to successfully protect the message as it cascades down the organization. And then, of course, top down and then lateral upward are the two others. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The checklist for over communicating clarity is that you'll know you're doing it if the leadership team has answered all of the 6 questions that we've talked about, and that all of the other employees are also sharing that language, right? That's another way to measure. So team members are regularly reminding people in their departments about all 6 of the things, 6 of those 6 questions that we talked about. It's a part of the culture. It's something that teams across the organization and down the organization have a shared language around again. Everybody essentially leaves meetings with clear, specific agreements as to how and what to communicate to their employees, and that those messages don't take too long to get down the organization, right? And so everybody understands these messages are important, and as soon as the decision is made, that this message can be very succinctly and very quickly moved down and across the organizations. Employees are able to accurately articulate the organization's reason for existence, right? So we talked about that. So what does that mean? Why are we here? What are we doing? What's our purpose? And then also, what are the values that our organization stands behind and sort of represents? What are our strategic anchors, and how are we going? What are our goals, and how are we going to meet those goals? And then finally, the 4th piece of the organizational health model is, after you've over-communicated the clarity, you've got to have systems in place to actually reinforce that clarity, right? So the human systems that organizations rely on for reinforcement. Once the messages are clear and you've over-communicated those, then you've got to be able to reinforce that. So the organization, a checklist for it is that the organization has a simple way to ensure that everybody that's new that enters the organization is selected based on those company values and based on fit. We know that, especially in today's market, there's a ton of applications for specific roles, and there are a lot of people that are able to do the job. That does not necessarily mean that they are the right fit for the organization. How do you measure that fit? In part, you measure it based on those values that are clearly defined, that everybody has a shared understanding of. And then if you can do that, then that's one step in reinforcing the clarity that you want in your organization. And then after people have been selected and they're brought into the organization, you've got to be able to make sure that they have that same shared language around those 6 questions that we talked about, those 6 elements of clarity. And so, selecting the right people is important, but when the people are onboarding in the organization, it's important to make sure that one of the first things that's done is that they are thoroughly taught and that they completely understand the answers to those 6 questions. Excuse me, my mouth's a little dry. And then thirdly, that the managers throughout the organization have a consistent system for setting goals, reviewing progress with employees, and that all of those things are centered around the 6 questions that created the clarity in the first place. And then also one of the harder things is that employees who don't fit the values are simply managed out. You have to be able, this goes through the accountability piece. You've got to be able to hold people accountable to what those values and what those behaviors are. Maybe they were a fit for the organization at one point in time, but maybe the organization has evolved and the values have shifted. But making sure that the people that are a part of this organization are consistently aligned with the values of the organization, and if not being scared to manage those individuals out. But the other side of the coin is maybe you have some poor performers who are they fit the values, they understand the values, they align with the values. Those are the people you want to keep. You want to spend time, energy, and resources on those individuals via coaching and any sort of assistance that they need to stay with the organization, because it's more important that you have people that fit and understand, the values of the organization, then have high performers that are complete mismatch, a complete mismatch for the organization in terms of its values and its behavioral expectations. And then 5, the obvious is you've got to have incentive systems that are built around those 6 questions, specifically the values and the goals of the organization. So just to sort of summarize here, the 4 pieces of the model are build a cohesive leadership team. We talked about the 5 dysfunctions, and they're listed here again for your reference, but that's the first thing that you have to do. You've got to make sure that the leadership team, the executive level team, and the highest level team in the organization is cohesive. And the way you do that is by first building trust, allowing for healthy conflict, which leads to healthy debate and a commitment from everybody on that team. And then from there, you can hold each other accountable for performance and the behaviors aligned with those decisions. And from there, you can focus on the results that need attention. And then the second piece of the model is creating the clarity. So here's the 6 questions again. Why do we exist? How do we behave? What is it that we actually do? And how will we succeed in that space? What's most important right now? And who in our organization has to do what for us to be able to succeed? Over communicating clarity. So repetition, simplicity, using multiple communication channels and mediums, and then cascading those messages down and making sure that they're protected as they filter their way across and down the organization. And then finally, reinforcing clarity. So it's really about hiring, it's about managing performance appropriately, and that performance that needs to be aligned strictly with the values of the organization. And then, of course, incentivizing via rewards and recognition, and not being scared to manage people out who are just simply not a fit for the values of the organization. So to summarize, I just wanted to again say that all of this content is the organizational health model that was built by Patrick Lencioni, who was a partner of our center here at Santa Clara University in the Silicon Valley Executive Center. We recently finished an online asynchronous badge in organizational health. We're working on the next 2 badges, and it will be a series of 3. And all 3 of those badges will give participants an opportunity to learn every piece of this model and to practice it real time in their own context as they work their way through the program. So you can look for that soon. The first badge will be launching here in the next couple of weeks, and then we're hoping to finish the product and get it to market by the end of our fiscal year, which is June. And so it's been a pleasure. At this time, I'd like to turn it over for some questions. I know we're right at about 10 minutes left, and so if we can have a few questions, that'd be awesome.
Great. Dennis, thank you so much, first of all, for this very insightful presentation. Thank you for your time. Now we'll turn it over to questions. First off, we have one from Lauren. She's wondering, you talk about finding the right fit for people. Do you, in your opinion, is it easier to hire someone for the right fit to build the right culture or a good fit for the culture, or adapt as a leader to create a healthy organization? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you've got to create the health first, right? So you've got to start with having that team and creating the clarity and really answering those 6 questions that we talked about, so that everybody has a shared understanding of all of the things that are important for that organization. And from there, it's about fit, right? And so to hire somebody in before you've been able to really answer those 6 questions, I think would be a mistake. You got to have clarity first, and then you can find clarity around everything we talked about, including, values, behavior, all of those things. And then from there, you can source people that that are a natural fit for those things that you've created clarity around. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Well, kind of along the same veins of that, Gary here is wondering, when you have a situation where leadership teams are constantly changing and pivoting priorities, how do you address that issue? How do you stay afloat? How do you maintain healthy organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something that's really difficult to manage, right? Because a lot of organizations deal with turnover in that way on a regular basis, which is why I think it's important to ensure that you have those anchors. So depending on who's in the role, those anchors shouldn't shift too much, right? I mean, so you really, the organization, if you've done your due diligence with really understanding those 6 questions that we talked about, and then you suddenly have a new CEO that comes in that may have a different, a different perspective on what the values should be, then you've got to go through that process again of making sure that the organization, as it is in its current reality with this new CEO or this new team member, that you go through this process of creating clarity again. And if those values shift, as long as those values shift and you can follow the other pieces of the model where you're able to create the clarity and then disseminate that clarity down and across the organization, then you're in a healthy place. Now, if you're having a new CEO every year, it's going to really damage the organization, right? So I think having turnover is something that's natural. Every organization deals with that. But if it interrupts the core value of the organization, then it's the responsibility of those leaders to make sure that everybody is back on the same page as quickly as possible with whatever the new direction is for that organization. That's a tricky question, but that's essentially I think that the model stands. You've really got to ensure that clarity exists, no matter how much turnover that you have to deal with.
Great. And we have a question from Maria here. She says, why is it so difficult for organizations to get this? Things like clear communication should be so easy. Maybe perhaps you can also add, what are some of the blind spots that are very common?
Yeah, I honestly think that organizations simply don't take enough time to focus on these things. They seem simple, but the reality is, because they're simple, I think they're overlooked by a lot of leaders and by a lot of just employees in general. And so it's the leader's responsibility to make sure that the focus is there on these really simple but very, very critical questions that have to be maintained in order to have sustainable health in an organization. Why that doesn't happen on a regular basis, especially because it seems so simple, I think is that people maybe oftentimes assume that these things are already in place. And the truth is, unless you're having a continuous conversation around these things, you can't assume that they're there. You can't assume that that's true. And so you have to spend the resources and carve the time necessary to have a continual focus on everything that we've talked about today. Great question.
Great. Now, Jeremy here has a question about, if you're already in an unhealthy work culture, what are some immediate next steps you can do to improve the situation?
I'm sorry, immediate steps to improve an unhealthy culture?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you're in an unhealthy culture, I don't know where you are in the organization, but it's first the responsibility of the leaders of that organization to really become cohesive, right? That's why the org health model starts with having the leadership of the organization be cohesive. And so if you're in an unhealthy culture, I don't know this for a fact because I don't know your specific organizational context, but it could be stemming from the fact that the leadership team is not on the same page. So that's the first thing that has to happen. Now, if you're not on that leadership team, then what you can do is you can at least create health, at whatever level of the organization that you're at, right? This same model that we've gone through that starts with a cohesive leadership team, you can apply those same principles at other levels of the organization. So say you're a mid-level manager and you're responsible for your own team in a certain functional unit. You can still use this same model to ensure the health of the organization that you have authority over or are a part of. And if the health or the dysfunction is coming from a place that's higher than you that you don't have access to or you're unable to influence, then perhaps you're not a good fit for that organization. I think a lot of it is about fit. We talked about fit at the end of this presentation, and I really think that understanding that your happiness at the end of the day, all of us, the happier we are in our workplace, the more productive we're going to be. And so if you're in a very unhealthy culture and you don't have the ability to influence the changes that need to happen to create more of a healthy culture, then perhaps you're not a fit for that organization, and maybe you should look for other opportunities. Otherwise, if you're in a position where you do have control or you do have influence over the things that we've been talking about today, then it's your responsibility to act on the things that we've talked about.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that response. We're going to pivot a little bit. We have a more specific question here I think can still apply to a lot of people from Kian. They said that we are a startup company in healthcare technology. How can we keep a small team motivated and hold more accountability?
It's really hard with startup organizations. I work with startup organizations. I'm actually consulting one particular startup organization here in the Valley, and it's really difficult. Why? Because there's multiple hats that you have to wear. Startup culture is completely different than mature organizations, right? And so a lot of times what you're managing is simple workload because there's so much that has to be done, and there's only a handful of people that have to get that job done. And so the beauty of it is that because typically the organizations are smaller and there's a lot fewer people that have to be managed, it's easier, in my opinion, to at least have you have more of an opportunity to address the things that we've talked about in this webinar because there are fewer people, right? And so communication and the communication methods and channels, all of those are easier to create because it's a smaller group. So that's the benefit. Now, carving out the time is the hard part, especially for startups, for people that are working crazy hours and wearing multiple different hats. And so again, I'd have to point to the leadership of that startup to ensure that they are carving out the necessary time to focus on it. It has to be a priority. That's the only way that it works. And so I hope that it helps to answer your question. I can relate. We're right here in the Valley. We do a lot of work with startups. And that's a shared concern for smaller organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And to use one more question to close out the Q&A section, do you have any suggested further reading on the topic? Any suggestions?
Yeah, so this organizational health model is pulled right from Pat's most recent book, The Advantage. So that is the reading that if you want to really take a deeper dive, you're going to want to start there. Now, the first piece of the model that we talked about comes from one of his earlier books, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And so I'd encourage you to start with that and then continue with The Advantage. Now, if you've completed both of those books, there's an enormous amount of resources that are available directly on the Table Group website. And many of those resources we have built into our digital program that I talked about that we're going to be launching. And so I'd encourage you, if you're interested and you want to learn how to apply these concepts in your own context and do it in a way that's asynchronous, sort of on your own time and self-paced, I'd encourage you to purchase our digital badge because and maybe have your team members do it together with you. I think if the team is going through it together, it creates conversation and it allows the cohesion to start, from the very beginning. And so, there's tons of resources out there. If you want additional readings, I'd encourage you to visit the Org Health website.
Wonderful. Again, Dennis, thank you so much for the presentation today. We hope everyone enjoyed and learned a lot. Thank you to everyone for joining us today as well. We hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.